Grisly crimes from the past, the Vicar and the Choirmistress. Even today, the headlines would cause a sensation. Vicar and Choirmistress murdered in Lover's Lane. The congregation were both scandalized to learn of the love affair between their clergyman and a married woman, and horrified by the killing. Yet, no one was ever convicted of the double murder, and the mystery remains to this day. A courting couple discovered the bodies of the Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Mrs. Eleanor Mills, choir leader at his church, on 16 September 1922. The spot, by an abandoned farm near New Brunswick, New Jersey, was a favorite with lovers seeking solitude. Hall, minister of St. John the Evangelist Church in New Brunswick, and his mistress had both been shot through the head. But more sinister, the choir leader's vocal cords had been cut in an act of savage hate. The pair's passionate letters to each other were sewn contemptuously around the bodies. Hall's wife Frances was questioned, as were Mrs. Mill's husband James. But no charges were brought. Mrs. Hall was a popular figure among the church-going community. There were stories of detective ignoring clues, of vital evidence going missing, and of a prosecutor unwilling to take action. There was neither a post-mortem nor an inquest. There the case might have been conveniently closed, but for a news-hungry editor convinced there had been a cover-up. Philip Payne of the New York Mirror sent his own sleuth to the scene to piece together the evidence. They managed to get hold of Hall's calling card, which police have found propped against his body, and Payne claimed it carried the fingerprints of Mrs. Hall's brother Willie. Faced with this and other evidence, police brought murder charges against Mrs. Hall, her cousin Henry Carpenter, a brother Henry Stephen, and Willie. Willie, the strangest defendant, was an eccentric who liked to dress up in fireman's uniform and put out fires in his own backyard. They were finally brought to trial 4 years after the killing, in November 1926. After so long, memories were fading. The wealthy Mrs. Hall's high-powered lawyers made mincemeat of the prosecution's witnesses' shaky testimony. Soon it became clear that the prosecution's case rested one alleged eyewitness, Jane Gibson, a pig farmer. Dying of cancer, she was wheeled into court in a hospital bed and whispered her vital evidence. 4 years earlier, then a fit and vigorous countrywoman, she said she had been exercising her mule Jenny on the night of the murders. She identified the 4 defendants and said she had seen them in the lane where the bodies were later found. With them were the Reverend Hall and Mrs. Mill. Voices were raised in anger, she said, and there were mention of love letters. Mrs. Gibson rode away, wanting no part of a family quarrel. Her testimony, delivered firmly despite her pain, obviously impressed the jury. But then a relative gave evidence denying that Mrs. Gibson had been out of the house that night. Moments later, the courtroom was rocked by the news that a prisoner in jail in New York had confessed to the killing. But he was exposed as a sensation seeker who was nowhere near New Brunswick when the murders were committed. Witnesses gave the Stephens brothers and cousin Henry watertight alibis, and the defense then suggested that Mrs. Gibson had shot the couple thinking they were thieves after her corn. But the most telling witness of all was the incredibly calm Mrs. Hall. She had loved her husband dearly, she said, and had never suspected an infidelity. Least of all with Eleanor Mills, whom she had always regarded as her dearest friend. Mrs. Hall said she could not account for Jane Gibson's testimony, but would forgive her because of her suffering. The jury believed the wronged wife, and all 4 defendants were acquitted. It was a subdued crowd who left the courtroom, knowing that somewhere in their midst a killer was still at large. And some strange events followed. Mrs. Hall sued the New York Mirror for $2 million. Philip Payne, desperate to rebuild his reputation, set out to make a record-translated flight to Rome. His plane vanished. Officials who had been accused of concealing evidence lived under a cloud, and those involved in prosecution were eased from office. Witnesses for both sides were struck by a succession of tragedies. Soon after Mrs. Gibson's death, Mrs. Hall also died of cancer. And so, one by one, did the other defendants. The case remains unsolved. If you have enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment as it helps the YouTube algorithm grow the channel. You'd find similar contents in my other videos. Have a safe day, signing off.